O God, open our eyes to see, open our ears to hear, open our hearts to love. Amen. On both Thursday morning and Friday morning, I woke up with a sense of unease, a feeling that something bad had happened, that all was not right with the world. And then into my consciousness came the dawning awareness that Donald Trump was President-elect of the United States. Anger and fear had triumphed. Blatant misogyny, racism, homophobia and xenophobia were not enough to dissuade people who understandably wanted a better economic deal from electing a person who was ignorant and narcissistic, temperamentally unstable, to a position of enormous power. I had watched the election results on Wednesday afternoon while trying to write the liturgy that's in front of you this morning based on the lectionary readings, including the promise of new heavens and a new earth, where there will be no more weeping, where infant mortality is no more, where people build houses and live in the house that they built rather than labouring for the benefit of the wealthy elite, where the crops they plant feed their families rather than creating profit for industrial agriculture, where people shall not labour in vain, working multiple minimum wage jobs to feed their families. By the middle of the afternoon, I stopped writing the liturgy and I just sat and watched, thinking about what it was going to be like to be Muslim, to be an undocumented migrant, a young black man, a lesbian woman, a gay man, a transgender kid, a woman needing an abortion in Donald Trump's America. And I thought about the rest of the world, about the poor, the refugees, the people in war-torn places, though in truth I do not think that the hawkish policies of Hillary Clinton would have been good for the world either. And in Australia, the enthusiastic response to the Trump victory by One Nation and by the right wing of the Liberal Party disturbed me greatly. I think that the most frightening consequence of this election campaign, at least in the short term, seems to have been the permission giving to attack verbally and even physically people who are different, and it is happening here too. The vision of Isaiah, the promise of God's justice and peace, seemed so far away. Over the next few days, I read vast amounts of analysis. I think it's important to understand what happened, why it happened, so that we can plan and so that we can act decisively in response. As I wrote in the E-News, I lived for over 12 years in the United States. From the mid-80s to the mid-90s, I lived in New York City, in that rarefied atmosphere. And in 2010, I lived for 6 months in Dayton, Ohio, while I had a fellowship at the Kettering Foundation. I didn't really meet any Republicans when I was living in New York, but I met Republicans in Dayton. Some of them were good people, just old school conservatives. I also met Tea Party supporters. Dayton had formerly been the centre of automotive manufacturing. Charles Kettering, whose fortune funded the foundation where I was doing research, had invented the electric starter motor for the automobile. The Kettering Foundation was located in a leafy green suburb with manicured lawns and beautifully kept houses. There was an easy affluence amongst the privileged who lived and worked there. But to the north of the city, economic devastation was evident in poor black neighbourhoods and in abandoned tracts of middle and working class housing. Families unable to pay mortgages on homes that had plummeted in value when tens of thousands of jobs were lost during the global financial crisis had simply mailed the keys to their houses back to the banks and walked away. Weeds overtook gardens and paint peeled in the sun. Seeing the loss of a secure lifestyle and the loss of the hope of the American dream helped me to understand the Tea Party and the rise of Donald Trump. I agree with the filmmaker Michael Moore that the Democratic Party failed to understand or address the plight of poor and working people. In the US, the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. and if you get tips, it's $2.13 an hour. It's worth dramatically less than it was 20 years ago. And even people who work more than one job can be desperately poor, while the rich continue to get obscenely wealthy. And while this explains the explosive anger and fear felt by many Americans who voted for Trump, I do not think it justifies the hate. Commentators are falling over themselves to argue whether it's economics or racism and sexism that determined the election outcome. I think it's both. It's really important to note that many of those who are disadvantaged economically are people of colour and migrant people. But like so many despots before him, Trump has used the fear of the minority other to incite anger and violence. Rather than blaming the elites, disadvantaged people were encouraged to blame Muslims, immigrants, people of colour, welfare recipients, and LGBTI people whose rights are seen as challenging the social arrangements of the good old days. So on Wednesday evening, as I took the bus to the worship team meeting to discuss Advent Hope, the election result was called. I was close to tears when I arrived. I felt anything but hopeful. And I realised that many people, Muslim people, immigrants and refugees, people of colour, LGBTI people, are genuinely fearful. Already there have been attacks on mosques, Muslim women's headscarves have been torn off, immigrant children have been taunted at school with chants of build the wall, and gay men have been bashed. It's too soon to know all of what will happen. Trump is fickle, and he has a pathological need to be liked. But after 3 days, as the dust begins to settle, I have returned again and again over the weekend to the text that promises us new heavens and a new earth. I don't think that Hillary Clinton would have been a bad president, but I also do not think that she would have overturned the politics of business as usual that benefits the elites. She is one of them. As Peter Harcher wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald yesterday, she is the very embodiment of the wealthy, connected, entitled establishment. Though he won't deliver, Trump supporters want that system blown up and destroyed, and that system does need to be transformed. I am not suggesting at all that Donald Trump is part of God's plan, but we are being invited into a vision that is far more radical than anything that most politicians are offering. In retrospect, it appears to me that Bernie Sanders, a Jewish socialist, was closer to Isaiah's version than anyone else on the political landscape, except perhaps Elizabeth Warren, who is my great hero and hope for the next election. It seems to me that it's important to remember that the passage in Isaiah was written at a time of disappointment. The people had returned from exile, but they were dwelling in the rubble. Maybe Jerusalem, where Isaiah walked, looked like Aleppo in Syria after the bombs, or like Italy after the earthquakes. The new temple was not a patch on the old. People were still suffering from the effects of oppression and displacement. People were hungering for hope. And Isaiah related a vision from God, who in the midst of suffering is about to create new heavens and a new earth, a joy and a delight. This is not a matter of optimism or positive thinking or a pipe dream. It calls us to pay attention to God's saying yes to life and justice in the midst of the no of suffering and exploitation. And it assures us that suffering will end because of the caring presence of an attentive, responsive, sacred presence who will bring transformation in a concrete, this world experience of all things made right in and through us and other people of goodwill. Biblical scholar Stephen Breck-Reed calls this dream God's project. I like the word project, perhaps as well as dream, because it invites us to join in. God calls to us through this ancient prophetic text and through the life and work of Jesus to join in with the intent of divine presence, which is justice, love, and peace. What better work is there for us to do or to give our lives to? Individually, personally, we cannot do much about US politics, but we can inhabit Isaiah's dream for a city and a land renewed, urban and rural, in Australia. Walter Brueggemann says this text describes God's intention for Israel, and he illuminates the text in its original setting while shining a light on our situation too. Post-exilic Israel was looking at the rubble, and so this week are we. Israel may have felt overwhelmed and threatened by empires and forces that it couldn't influence, let alone control. And we feel overwhelmed too. Israel worried about its children and lamented their deaths, as well as the wasted lives of those who toil in vain. And we worry and lament too. However, it's right in the midst of such despair-inducing circumstances that God speaks and moves. Brueggemann writes, "Ours is not an empty world of machinery where we get what we have coming to us. No," he says, "caring, healing communication is still possible. Life is not a driven or anxious monologue. God is findable." And that is the song of the promises and the image of the poets and prophets, the voices of Moses and Jesus, that a new world is about to be given, that we can trust ourselves to it and live as though in it. To this, in spite of what is and what has been, I want to say yes. How we do this now is our challenge. One of the encouraging acts that I have heard about follows on from the xenophobic attacks that happened after the Brexit vote in the UK, and that is people wearing a small but mighty safety pin on their clothing as a symbol of hope. Wearing the pin in public symbolises that we can be relied on to step in and to speak out against vilification. It has been picked up in the US this week, and I think we need it here too. On Friday morning, I spent time in an interfaith conversation which included Lena Jabali, a young Australian-born Muslim woman, mother of 4 young children. She has used her Lebanese cooking blog to promote spread hummus, not hate, connecting people of different races and faiths by sharing food. During the conversation, Lena spoke of her fear, though, of fear of using the trains in Sydney, particularly after the Lindt Cafe siege, and her concern that her daughters had been told on the train all Muslims are terrorists, her 8 and 10-year-old daughters, as they rode the train to school, even though they were accompanied by their father. She is worried that the US election and the rise of one nation will make them less safe. So this morning on the table, we have safety pins to share for anyone who would like to join in this simple act of solidarity that is an aspect of saying yes to God's project of welcome. Sometimes this may seem daunting. We don't know what kind of situations this will bring us into. But remember also the teaching of Jesus in Luke. Following Jesus means testifying to our trust in God in the midst of circumstances that test our confidence and our hope. We are called to witness to the project of God, to see what the world does not see, the broken-hearted people and the hope, to change our world and ourselves so that all are welcomed in. And if we are afraid that we are not enough to do this, Jesus reminds you, "I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict." With God's help, we will find courage to build a church where we struggle together, learning about the challenges facing our worlds and ourselves, and also learning to be people of an ethical vision grounded in the scriptures like Isaiah and Luke. We are far removed in time from their communities, But like them, we too look to the end of empires, to the end of empires that oppress, and to the hope of a world renewed for all God's people. It is a real hope and a challenging project. It will require us to change and our world to change, to live in healing and peace for all people and all creation. Hold on to that hope. Look around you and see who is here with you, and know that God too is with you. We are not alone. There is beauty for brokenness. Amen.